There I was, on my hands and knees in the employee bathroom of the restaurant I'd built from nothing 43 years ago, scrubbing urine stains off porcelain while my daughter-in-law Jessica stood over me with her arms crossed, checking her manicured nails and sighing dramatically every few seconds. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The smell of industrial bleach burned my nostrils, and my arthritic fingers cramped around the toilet brush. But what hurt most wasn't the physical pain. It was hearing my own son's voice echoing from the kitchen, laughing with the line cooks about something completely unrelated to the fact that his 68-year-old mother was being treated like hired help in the business she'd spent her entire adult life building. The fluorescent light above flickered, casting harsh shadows across the cracked tile floor that I'd been meaning to replace for years, but never had the time because I was always too busy making sure every other aspect of Romano's Italian kitchen was perfect. Now, apparently, I had all the time in the world for maintenance duties, courtesy of my new role as the establishment's unofficial janitor. Jessica tapped her designer heel against the doorframe, the sound echoing off the walls like a countdown timer to my dignity's complete disappearance. Make sure you get behind the base too, Helen. The health inspector will be here next week, and I can't have anything reflecting poorly on our management. Our management. The words stung worse than the chemicals seeping through my rubber gloves. This was my restaurant, built with my late husband's recipes and my own sweat and tears. Yet somehow I'd become nothing more than cleaning staff in the eyes of the woman who'd married my son 6 months ago and apparently decided that meant she was entitled to run my life. Looking back now, I can see all the warning signs I chose to ignore. All the red flags I painted green with my desperate hope that things would work out differently. But that morning, kneeling on that cold bathroom floor while my son's wife treated me like an inconvenience in my own establishment, I couldn't see anything except the reflection of a foolish old woman in the toilet bowl water, wondering how the hell I'd gotten here. My name is Helen Romano, and if you'd told me 5 years ago that I'd be living in the small apartment above my restaurant, dependent on my son's goodwill for basic necessities while watching him and his wife systematically dismantle everything I'd worked for, I would have laughed in your face. 5 years ago, I was the undisputed queen of Romano's, the woman who'd turned a struggling pizzeria in downtown Millbrook into the most successful family restaurant in 3 counties. I knew every employee by name, every regular customer's order by heart, and every inch of that building like it was an extension of my own body. The story really begins back in 1981, when my husband Anthony and I were both 25 and stupid enough to think love and determination were sufficient ingredients for business success. We'd scraped together $8,000 from wedding gifts, borrowed another $12,000 from my father-in-law's pension fund, and signed a lease on a narrow storefront wedged between a defunct hardware store and a beauty salon that specialized in perms so elaborate they defied gravity. The previous tenant had been a Chinese takeout place that had lasted exactly 4 months, leaving behind grease stains on the walls and a lingering smell of old cooking oil that took us weeks to eliminate. Anthony had learned to cook from his grandmother, a fierce Italian woman who'd immigrated to America with nothing but a suitcase full of family recipes and an unshakable belief that food was love made tangible. She'd taught him that every meal should be prepared like you were feeding your own family, that corners should never be cut when it came to quality, and that a restaurant's reputation was built one satisfied customer at a time. These weren't just cooking philosophies to Anthony. They were sacred principles that guided every decision we made during those early years. I'd never planned to be a restaurateur. My college degree was in accounting, and I'd originally intended to work for one of the big firms in the city, climbing the corporate ladder while Anthony pursued his culinary dreams. But love makes you do crazy things, and watching my husband's face light up when he talked about creating something special, something that would bring families together over exceptional food, I found myself abandoning my sensible career plans and diving headfirst into the chaotic world of restaurant ownership. Those first few years were brutal in ways that romantic comedies never quite capture. We worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week, with Anthony in the kitchen perfecting recipes while I handled everything else: bookkeeping, scheduling, inventory, customer service, and 1,000 other details that nobody warns you about when you're young and optimistic and convinced that passion alone will carry you through. I learned to change light fixtures and unclog drains, to smooth over conflicts between temperamental line cooks, and negotiate with suppliers who thought they could take advantage of inexperienced business owners. Money was constantly tight during those early years. There were months when we couldn't afford to pay ourselves, surviving on leftover bread and whatever ingredients were close to expiring. I remember one particularly difficult winter when the heating system broke down, and we couldn't afford repairs. So we kept the restaurant warm by running the ovens constantly and hoping the health department wouldn't notice that our dining room was barely above freezing. Anthony would joke that we were offering our customers an authentic Italian experience, since most of the great recipes were developed by people who couldn't afford adequate heating anyway. But slowly, gradually, we built something special. Anthony's food was extraordinary, but more than that, we created an atmosphere that made people feel like they were being welcomed into our home rather than just served a meal. I learned every regular customer's name, remembered their preferences, asked about their families, and celebrated their milestones. We hosted birthday parties and anniversary dinners, first dates and business meetings, graduation celebrations, and funeral receptions. Romano's became woven into the fabric of our community in ways that went far beyond mere commerce. When I became pregnant with Marcus in 1984, I was determined not to let motherhood slow down the business we'd worked so hard to build. I worked until the day I went into labor, taking inventory between contractions and fielding phone calls from suppliers while Anthony timed my breathing exercises. 3 weeks after Marcus was born, I was back at the restaurant with a bassinet, tucked behind the hostess station, proving that it was possible to raise a baby and run a business simultaneously, though I wouldn't recommend the experience to anyone who values their sanity. Marcus grew up in Romano's the way some children grow up on farms, absorbing the rhythms and responsibilities of family business through daily exposure rather than formal instruction. He learned to count by sorting silverware, developed his reading skills by studying menu descriptions, and earned his first allowance by helping bus tables during the dinner rush. By the time he was 10, he could work a complete shift during busy weekends, charming customers with his enthusiasm and natural charisma, while demonstrating an intuitive understanding of hospitality that seemed to be encoded in his DNA. Anthony, and I always assumed that Marcus would eventually take over Romano's, though we never pressured him explicitly about his future career choices. We wanted him to pursue his own interests, develop his own talents, and choose his own path, even if that path led away from the family business. But Marcus never showed interest in anything else, spending his teenage summers working every position in the restaurant, learning the business from the ground up with the same dedication his father had shown toward perfecting his craft. The tragedy struck on a Tuesday morning in March 2003, when Marcus was 19 and finishing his sophomore year at the local community college, studying business management with the explicit goal of modernizing Romano's operations. Anthony had been complaining about chest pains for several weeks, but in typical stubborn fashion, he'd refused to see a doctor, insisting that the discomfort was just stress-related tension that would resolve itself once tax season was over. I'd been nagging him to make an appointment, threatening to call his doctor myself if he didn't take his symptoms seriously. But Anthony was convinced that acknowledging potential health problems was the same as inviting them to become real. He collapsed in the kitchen during the lunch prep, clutching his chest and struggling to breathe while I screamed for someone to call 911. I held his hand in the ambulance, whispering reassurances that everything would be fine, that he just needed to rest, that we'd take a real vacation once he was feeling better. The paramedics worked frantically, but I could see in their faces that they weren't optimistic. Anthony died at the hospital 3 hours later, leaving me with a devastated son, a restaurant full of employees who depended on us for their livelihood, and absolutely no idea how to continue without the man who'd been my partner in everything. The funeral was held at St. Mary's Catholic Church, the same place where Anthony and I had been married 22 years earlier. The entire community turned out to pay their respects, filling every pew and spilling into the aisles with a display of love and support that should have been comforting but instead felt overwhelming. Customer after customer approached me with stories about how Anthony's food had been part of their family celebrations, how Romano's had been the setting for their most important memories, how our restaurant had created a sense of belonging in their lives that extended far beyond mere dining experiences. I wanted to crawl into a hole and grieve privately, but I had responsibilities that couldn't be postponed for personal sorrow. Marcus was falling apart, barely functional in his grief, and the restaurant couldn't survive without someone taking charge immediately. So I dried my tears, put on my apron, and walked back into Romano's kitchen 3 days after burying my husband, determined to keep his legacy alive, even though I wasn't sure I had the strength to carry on without him. Those months after Anthony's death were the hardest of my life, but they were also when I discovered capabilities I'd never known I possessed. I learned to manage the kitchen operations that had always been Anthony's domain, studying his recipes and techniques with the intensity of a graduate student preparing for comprehensive exams. I couldn't replicate his intuitive genius, but I could maintain the standards he'd established, ensuring that every dish that left our kitchen met the quality expectations our customers had learned to associate with the Romano name. Marcus struggled with his father's death in ways that worried me deeply. He'd lost his role model, his mentor, and his clearest vision of his own future all at once. For months, he seemed lost, going through the motions of helping at the restaurant without the enthusiasm that had previously defined his relationship with the family business. I watched him grapple with questions about whether he really wanted to spend his life in the food service industry, whether he was equipped to fill his father's shoes, whether Romano's could survive the transition to the next generation. But, gradually, slowly, Marcus began to emerge from his grief with a renewed sense of purpose. He threw himself into learning every aspect of the restaurant business with an intensity that reminded me of his father, but with a modern perspective that brought fresh ideas to our traditional operations. He researched new cooking techniques, studied contemporary restaurant management practices, and developed plans for expanding our catering services and updating our dining room decor. Most importantly, he seemed to genuinely understand that Romano's was more than just a business. It was a community institution that carried responsibilities beyond mere profit generation. By 2005, Marcus had essentially become my full partner in running Romano's, handling the day-to-day kitchen operations while I focused on the front-of-house management and financial oversight. We made a good team, combining his youthful energy and innovative ideas with my experience and established relationships. The restaurant prospered under our joint leadership, earning recognition from food critics and industry publications while maintaining the warm, family-friendly atmosphere that had always been our trademark. Marcus was 28 when he started dating Jessica Chen, a marketing coordinator for a regional hotel chain who'd moved to Millbrook from Seattle to take a position with better advancement opportunities. She was undeniably beautiful, with glossy black hair and a wardrobe that suggested either excellent fashion sense or substantial disposable income, possibly both. More importantly, she seemed genuinely interested in Marcus as a person, rather than just as the heir to a successful local business, asking thoughtful questions about his goals and dreams while demonstrating real enthusiasm for his culinary ambitions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I liked Jessica initially, or at least I thought I did. She was polite and articulate, professionally accomplished in her own right, and clearly devoted to my son in ways that made him happier than I'd seen him since his father's death. She brought out a lighter side of Marcus's personality, encouraging him to take time off from the restaurant occasionally to pursue hobbies and interests that weren't directly related to the family business. After years of watching him work himself to exhaustion in an effort to honor his father's memory, it was refreshing to see him enjoying life again. But even during their courtship, there were small moments that made me uncomfortable, tiny interactions that suggested Jessica viewed Romano's as something to be improved rather than preserved. She'd make casual comments about how the dining room decor was dated, how our marketing strategy was insufficiently sophisticated, how we were missing opportunities to expand our brand recognition. These observations weren't necessarily wrong, but they were delivered with a confidence that seemed premature, given her limited exposure to our operations and customer base. Jessica also had very definite opinions about work-life balance, frequently pointing out that Marcus was spending too much time at the restaurant, that he needed to establish better boundaries between his professional and personal life. This advice wasn't unreasonable, but it came from someone who'd never experienced the unique pressures of family business ownership. Someone who didn't understand that Romano's wasn't just Marcus's job, but his inheritance, his responsibility, and his connection to his father's legacy. When Marcus announced their engagement in the spring of 2012, I was genuinely happy for him, though I couldn't shake a nagging sense of unease about what marriage might mean for our working relationship. Jessica had never expressed direct interest in becoming involved with restaurant operations, but she'd made it clear that she expected to have input into major decisions affecting their financial future. Since Romano's represented the vast majority of Marcus's assets and income, this essentially meant she expected to have a voice in business decisions that I'd been making independently for nearly a decade. The wedding was beautiful, held at the Azim Country Club with a reception that showcased the best of Romano's catering capabilities. Jessica looked stunning in a designer gown that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. And Marcus was radiantly happy, clearly convinced that he'd found the perfect partner for building the life he'd always imagined. I danced with my new daughter-in-law, welcomed her to the family with genuine warmth, and tried to suppress my concerns about how our family dynamics might change now that there was another voice in the decision-making process. For the first few months of their marriage, everything seemed to proceed smoothly. Jessica maintained her position with the hotel chain, while Marcus continued his full-time commitment to Romano's, and they settled into a comfortable routine that balanced their professional obligations with their personal relationship. Jessica would occasionally stop by the restaurant for dinner, chatting with customers and observing our operations with what seemed like genuine interest rather than critical assessment. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, things began to shift. Jessica started making suggestions about operational improvements, recommendations that were presented as helpful observations, but carried an underlying assumption that she had the right to offer unsolicited advice about how we conducted our business. She'd point out inefficiencies in our ordering processes, question our staffing decisions, and propose menu modifications that would supposedly appeal to younger demographics or health-conscious diners. Initially, I tried to be receptive to her input, recognizing that fresh perspectives could be valuable even when they came from someone without direct restaurant experience. But Jessica's suggestions weren't offered as collaborative brainstorming. They were presented as obvious improvements that any competent manager would immediately implement. When I explained why certain changes might not be practical or appropriate for our specific customer base, she'd respond with polite condescension, implying that my resistance was based on outdated thinking rather than legitimate business considerations. The real turning point came in early 2013 when Jessica quit her hotel position to focus on what she described as consulting work for local businesses. She claimed to have expertise in marketing and operational efficiency that could benefit Romano's, and she began spending significant time at the restaurant, ostensibly to better understand our operations, so she could provide more targeted recommendations. But instead of observing and learning, she immediately began identifying problems and proposing solutions with the confidence of someone who'd been studying our business for years rather than weeks. Jessica's presence changed the entire atmosphere at Romano's in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. Employees who'd worked with me for years suddenly seemed uncertain about chain of command, unsure whether they should follow my instructions or defer to suggestions from the boss's wife. Longtime customers noticed the difference too, commenting that the restaurant felt less welcoming, more corporate, as if some essential element of warmth and personality had been systematically removed. But the most troubling change was in Marcus himself. My son, who'd been my trusted partner for nearly 8 years, began questioning decisions we'd always made collaboratively, second-guessing policies that had served us well for decades. He'd listened to Jessica's critiques of our operations with serious attention, nodding thoughtfully at suggestions that directly contradicted practices we'd refined through years of experience. When I'd express concerns about implementing changes too quickly or dramatically, Marcus would respond with gentle but firm reminders that Jessica brought valuable outside perspective to our traditional approach. The financial pressure began in small ways that seemed reasonable on the surface. Jessica and Marcus had purchased a house that required a substantial down payment, and they'd assumed a mortgage that represented a significant monthly obligation. Jessica's consulting income was irregular, especially in the beginning, so I needed Romano's to generate enough profit to cover their increased living expenses. This meant scrutinizing every aspect of our operations for potential cost savings, questioning expenditures that had previously been accepted as necessary business expenses. Employee benefits were the first casualty of this new financial pressure. Jessica argued convincingly that our healthcare contributions were excessive compared to industry standards, that our paid vacation policies were too generous for a small business, that our holiday bonuses represented an unnecessary drain on profits that could be better used for business expansion or employee wages. Each individual change seemed logical, but collectively they represented a fundamental shift in how we treated the people who'd helped build Romano's success over the years. Menu prices increased twice during 2013, justified by rising food costs, and the need to maintain profit margins in an increasingly competitive market. But the increases seemed larger than necessary, designed more to maximize revenue than to offset legitimate expense increases. Long-term customers began complaining about the higher prices, especially when they weren't accompanied by obvious improvements in food quality or service. Several regulars started coming less frequently, and a few stopped coming altogether, expressing disappointment that Romano's was apparently prioritizing profits over customer loyalty. But the most significant change was Jessica's growing involvement in day-to-day operations. What had started as occasional suggestions evolved into regular presence, then into active participation in management decisions. She created new policies for employee scheduling, inventory management, and customer service that were implemented without consulting me, despite the fact that I was supposedly still the primary owner and operator of the business. When I questioned these unilateral changes, Jessica would explain that she'd discussed everything with Marcus, and since he was my designated successor, he had the authority to approve modifications to our standard procedures. The transition happened so gradually that I didn't fully recognize what was occurring until it was essentially complete. One day, I was the unquestioned authority at Romano's, making decisions based on 4 decades of experience and deep understanding of our customer base. The next day, it seemed, I was being treated like a senior employee whose opinions were valued, but whose authority was definitely subordinate to the younger generation's vision for the future. Marcus seemed genuinely convinced that this transition was natural and beneficial, that Jessica's modern business practices would position Romano's for continued success in a changing marketplace. He'd present their joint decisions as collaborative efforts that combined the best of traditional values with contemporary efficiency, never acknowledging that my input had been systematically minimized or that my role had been fundamentally redefined without my consent. By late 2013, I was feeling increasingly isolated and frustrated, watching my life's work being transformed into something I barely recognized. The restaurant was still profitable, perhaps more profitable than it had ever been, but it felt sterile and unwelcoming in ways that went beyond mere aesthetic changes. The sense of family and community that had always been Romano's defining characteristic was being sacrificed for operational efficiency and maximum revenue generation. But I told myself that these growing pains were temporary, that Marcus and Jessica would eventually find a balance between innovation and tradition that honored our legacy while positioning the business for future growth. I convinced myself that my discomfort was probably generational, that older people naturally resist change even when it's beneficial, that my concerns were based more on sentiment than sound business judgment. The proposal came in December 2013, during what I thought was going to be a routine family dinner, but turned out to be a carefully orchestrated presentation about the future of Romano's. Marcus and Jessica had prepared a detailed analysis of the restaurant's financial performance, market position, and growth potential, complete with charts and projections that demonstrated their thorough research and serious consideration of long-term strategy. They wanted me to officially transfer ownership of Romano's to Marcus, maintaining my involvement as a paid consultant, but removing the legal and financial responsibilities that had defined my role for the past 30 years. Jessica explained that this transition would provide tax advantages, simplify business decision-making, and allow me to enjoy my golden years without the stress of daily management obligations. Marcus emphasized that nothing would really change in terms of my day-to-day involvement, that I'd continue to be deeply involved in all major decisions, that they simply wanted to formalize the succession process that had been evolving naturally over the previous few years. The proposal was presented with such logic and apparent consideration for my interests that I found myself nodding along with their reasoning, even while feeling profoundly uneasy about the implications. They'd obviously spent considerable time developing their arguments, anticipating my potential objections, and crafting responses that made my concerns seem selfish or irrational. When I expressed hesitation about making such a significant change so quickly, Jessica assured me that we could structure the transition gradually, that I could maintain as much or as little involvement as I wanted, that the primary goal was simply to ensure Romano's continued success under my son's leadership. What finally convinced me was Marcus's obvious enthusiasm for the proposal, his clear belief that taking full ownership would represent the culmination of everything he'd been working toward since his father's death. This was my son, the child I'd raised and trained and trusted with my most precious creation. If he felt ready to assume complete responsibility for Romano's, if he wanted the independence and authority that came with official ownership, how could I refuse him that opportunity? I agreed to the transfer in principle, but insisted on involving lawyers and accountants to ensure that the transition was structured properly and that my interests were adequately protected. Jessica was enthusiastic about professional oversight, claiming that proper documentation would benefit everyone involved by eliminating potential misunderstandings about roles and responsibilities. She even recommended several attorneys who specialized in family business transitions, lawyers who supposedly had extensive experience with similar situations. The legal process took 3 months to complete, during which I had multiple opportunities to reconsider my decision, but never quite summoned the courage to back out entirely. Every time I expressed second thoughts, Marcus would reassure me that I was making the right choice, that formal ownership transfer was simply a logical extension of the collaborative relationship we'd already developed. Jessica would add that my ongoing involvement was essential to the restaurant's success, that they couldn't imagine running Romano's without my guidance and expertise. The paperwork was finalized in March 2014, with ownership of Romano's Italian kitchen officially transferred to Marcus David Romano, my beloved son and the heir to everything his father and I had built together. I retained the title of senior consultant and received assurances that my input would continue to be valued, and my financial security would be protected through ongoing profit-sharing arrangements. There was even a small celebration dinner, with Marcus and Jessica toasting my generosity and their commitment to honoring the legacy I'd created. For the first few months after the ownership transfer, everything seemed to proceed exactly as promised. I maintained my regular schedule at the restaurant, continued to make major decisions collaboratively with Marcus, and received my monthly consultant payments without any problems. Jessica's involvement became more official, with a E, formal title of operations manager, and a salary that reflected her growing responsibilities. But the essential dynamics remained familiar, with me handling front-of-house operations while Marcus focused on kitchen management and Jessica worked on marketing and administrative functions. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, my role began to change in ways that weren't explicitly discussed but were unmistakably real. Decisions that had previously required my approval were made without consulting me, then presented as accomplished facts that I could either accept or challenge at the risk of creating unnecessary conflict. Employee scheduling, supplier relationships, menu modifications, and policy changes all began happening without my input, though Marcus and Jessica were always careful to explain their reasoning after the fact. When I raised concerns about being excluded from decision-making processes, Marcus would apologize for the oversight and promise to include me more systematically in future discussions. But the pattern continued, with my involvement becoming increasingly peripheral, despite repeated assurances that my experience and judgment were still valued and essential. Jessica would explain that they were simply trying to be more efficient, that involving too many people in routine decisions slowed down necessary changes, that my time was too valuable to waste on minor operational details. The financial arrangements also began to evolve in ways that weren't necessarily problematic, but definitely weren't what I'd originally understood. My monthly consultant payments were adjusted to reflect what Jessica described as more accurate assessments of my actual time contribution, since I was supposedly working fewer hours and handling fewer responsibilities than had been originally anticipated. The profit-sharing percentages were modified to account for increased business expenses and capital improvements that required immediate reinvestment rather than distribution to non-owner consultants. Each individual change was explained logically and presented as temporary adjustments that would be reversed once certain business objectives were achieved. But collectively, these modifications represented a systematic reduction in my financial compensation and practical authority. Changes that effectively redefined my relationship with Romano's from owner-consultant to senior employee. When I complained about the cumulative impact of these adjustments, Marcus would express surprise that I felt unfairly treated, pointing out that I was still receiving substantial compensation for work that many people my age would consider retirement-level responsibility. The living situation became an issue in late 2014, when Marcus and Jessica decided that the apartment above the restaurant, which had been my home for over a decade, was needed for business purposes. They wanted to convert the space into private dining areas for special events and corporate functions, improvements that would supposedly generate significant additional revenue while better utilizing the building's square footage. They offered to help me find suitable housing elsewhere, even volunteering to assist with moving expenses, but they made it clear that continuing to live above Romano's was no longer compatible with their expansion plans. I was devastated by this development, though I tried not to show it. The apartment wasn't just my home. It was my connection to the restaurant, my ability to respond immediately to emergencies or staffing problems, my sense of being an integral part of Romano's daily operations, rather than just an outside consultant who showed up for scheduled shifts. Living above the restaurant had also been economically advantageous, since it eliminated housing costs and allowed me to invest more of my income in business improvements and employee benefits. But Marcus and Jessica had obviously made their decision before approaching me, and my emotional attachment to the apartment was presented as an obstacle to necessary business development rather than a legitimate personal concern that deserved serious consideration. They'd already researched suitable rental properties in the area, calculated the costs associated with my relocation, and developed timelines for completing the conversion project. My preferences were solicited politely, but it was clear that the fundamental decision was not negotiable. I moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment across town in January 2015, a perfectly adequate space that nevertheless felt like exile from the life I'd built over the previous 40 years. The apartment was comfortable and affordable, but it was also generic and impersonal, lacking any connection to the history and relationships that had defined my identity for decades. Every morning, I had to drive to Romano's instead of simply walking downstairs, a change that seemed minor but felt symbolic of my increasingly peripheral role in the business I'd created. The conversion of my former apartment into private dining space was completed by spring 2015, and I had to admit that Jessica's vision was both attractive and functional. The new rooms were elegantly decorated and perfectly suited for hosting special events, birthday parties, and business meetings that generated significantly higher revenue per square foot than residential use had provided. The project was clearly successful from a financial perspective, and several customers complimented the improved facilities, noting that Romano's now offered dining options that weren't available elsewhere in the area. But watching strangers eat dinner in what had been my bedroom felt deeply unsettling, a constant reminder that my personal needs were now subordinate to business considerations in ways that hadn't been true when I was the owner. Marcus and Jessica were careful to acknowledge my sacrifice and express appreciation for my flexibility. But they also made it clear that this type of decision-making represented the new normal, that business growth required difficult choices that prioritized long-term success over individual convenience. By 2016, my role at Romano's had been reduced to what could generously be described as senior hostess, greeting customers and managing reservations, while Marcus and Jessica handled all aspects of actual restaurant management. My input was still solicited occasionally, usually when they encountered problems that required historical knowledge or long-time customer relationships. But I was no longer involved in strategic planning or daily operational decisions. I was treated with respect and appreciation, but it was the kind of deference shown to valued employees rather than business partners. The financial compensation continued to decline as my responsibilities diminished, though Marcus and Jessica were always careful to frame these reductions as adjustments that reflected my reduced time commitment rather than punitive measures. They'd point out that I was essentially working part-time hours while maintaining a lifestyle that many people would envy, that my consultant payments were still generous compared to what most seniors received from Social Security or pension plans. When I complained about feeling financially insecure, they'd remind me that I'd been fully compensated for the business transfer and that ongoing payments were essentially bonuses rather than obligations. But what hurt most wasn't the money, though the financial pressure was definitely stressful. What hurt was watching my life's work being transformed into something I barely recognized, seeing policies and practices that I'd developed over decades being discarded as outdated or inefficient. Romano's was still successful, arguably more successful than ever, but it felt corporate and impersonal in ways that contradicted everything I'd tried to create during my years as owner. The breaking point came in early 2017, during what I thought was going to be a routine staff meeting, but turned out to be an announcement about my new role as head of facility maintenance. Jessica explained that my extensive knowledge of the building's systems and history made me the ideal person to handle routine cleaning, minor repairs, and general upkeep responsibilities that would otherwise require expensive outside contractors. She presented this assignment as a cost-saving measure that would also ensure that maintenance tasks were completed according to my exacting standards, rather than by employees who might not appreciate the importance of proper care. Marcus nodded along with Jessica's explanation, adding that facility maintenance was a crucial responsibility that required someone with my attention to detail and commitment to excellence. He emphasized that this wasn't a demotion, but rather a recognition of my unique qualifications for ensuring that Romano's physical environment met the high standards our customers expected. They'd even arranged for a modest salary increase to reflect the additional responsibilities, though the increase was significantly smaller than what professional cleaning services would have cost. I sat in that meeting, listening to my son and daughter-in-law explain why I should be grateful for the opportunity to clean toilets in the restaurant I'd built from nothing, and realized that I'd been systematically manipulated into a position where I had no power, no authority, and no recourse, except to accept whatever role they deemed appropriate for me. The business transfer that had been presented as a natural succession had actually been a complete takeover, orchestrated by a woman who'd identified my weaknesses and exploited them with surgical precision. That night, alone in my generic apartment, with its builder-grade fixtures and complete lack of personality, I tried to figure out how I'd allowed this to happen. How had I gone from successful business owner to janitor in my own establishment? How had I allowed my love for my son to blind me to his wife's manipulative agenda? How had I been so stupid as to sign away everything I'd worked for without adequate protection for my own interests? But even then, scrubbing those toilet bowls while Jessica supervised my technique and Marcus ignored my humiliation, I couldn't quite believe that this was my permanent situation. Surely this was temporary. Surely Marcus would eventually recognize what was happening and intervene on my behalf. Surely Jessica's true nature would become apparent to everyone, and the situation would be corrected. I told myself that I just needed to be patient, to prove my value through whatever role they assigned me, to wait for the right opportunity to address the problems that had developed. I had no idea that the worst was yet to come, that Jessica's ambitions extended far beyond simply controlling Romano's operations, that my son's loyalty had been so completely transferred that he would eventually become complicit in treatment that went far beyond mere disrespect into the realm of actual cruelty. But that morning, kneeling on the bathroom floor while my daughter-in-law critiqued my cleaning technique, I was still holding on to hope that things could be salvaged, that the family business I'd devoted my life to could somehow be rescued from the people who were systematically destroying everything it had once represented. I was wrong about that, but I was right about one thing. I wasn't going to accept this situation indefinitely. Somewhere deep inside, the woman who'd built Romano's from nothing was still alive, still fighting, still capable of one final move that would change everything. I just didn't know it yet. The humiliation reached new depths over the following months as Jessica systematically stripped away every remaining vestige of my dignity and authority at Romano's. What had started as facility maintenance duties quickly expanded into a comprehensive list of menial tasks that kept me busy from opening to closing, but never involved me in any meaningful decision-making processes. I found myself emptying trash, cans that I'd never had to touch when I owned the place, mopping floors that had been cleaned by professional services for decades, and scrubbing grease stains from equipment that I'd purchased and maintained throughout my entire career. But the most degrading aspect wasn't the physical labor itself, though my 68-year-old body wasn't designed for spending hours on hands and knees scrubbing baseboards and cleaning behind industrial refrigerators. The real cruelty was the way Jessica supervised my work, checking my progress with the intensity of a drill sergeant inspecting military barracks, pointing out missed spots and inadequate attention to detail with a tone that suggested I was a lazy teenager rather than the woman who'd built the establishment she was now treating like her personal kingdom. Marcus seemed completely oblivious to how his wife was treating me. Or perhaps he was willfully blind to behavior that would have horrified him if he'd witnessed it being directed toward any other elderly woman. When I tried to discuss my concerns with him privately, he'd dismiss my complaints as generational misunderstandings or personality conflicts that could be resolved through better communication and mutual respect. He'd remind me that Jessica was under tremendous pressure managing the restaurant's daily operations, that she was simply trying to maintain the high standards that had always been Romano's trademark, that I should appreciate her dedication to preserving the legacy I'd created. The financial situation became increasingly precarious as my consultant payments were reduced again and again, each time with explanations that made the cuts seem reasonable and temporary. Jessica had discovered that certain maintenance tasks could be classified as independent contractor work rather than employee compensation, which allowed them to pay me significantly less while avoiding various taxes and benefit obligations. She'd present these changes as administrative improvements that would benefit everyone in the long run, though the primary beneficiary seemed to be the restaurant's profit margins rather than my personal financial security. By late 2017, my monthly income had dropped to barely a third of what I'd been receiving immediately after the ownership transfer, and I was struggling to cover basic living expenses in my small apartment. When I approached Marcus about the possibility of increasing my compensation to reflect the expanded scope of my responsibilities, he'd explain that the restaurant was going through a temporary cash flow crunch that required everyone to make sacrifices for the greater good. He'd point out that I was fortunate to have any income at all at my age, that most women my age were living on fixed incomes that didn't include the generous payments I was still receiving. But I knew Romano's financial situation better than Marcus realized, having developed relationships with suppliers and vendors that gave me insight into the restaurant's actual performance. Business was thriving, with revenue levels that exceeded anything we'd achieved during my ownership. Yet somehow there was never enough money to adequately compensate the woman who'd created the foundation for that success. The profits were being absorbed by Marcus and Jessica's increasingly lavish lifestyle, including expensive vacations, luxury purchases, and home renovations that would have been impossible on a restaurant manager's typical salary. Jessica's control over every aspect of Romano's operations became absolute during this period, extending far beyond the legitimate authority of an operations manager into the realm of complete dictatorship. She instituted new policies for employee behavior, customer interaction, and facility management that often contradicted decades of established practices, but questioning her decisions was treated as insubordination that wouldn't be tolerated. Long-term employees who'd worked with me for years began leaving for other positions, unable to adapt to Jessica's management style or unwilling to watch her systematic humiliation of the woman they'd always respected as their boss. The departure of experienced staff members was devastating to Romano's culture and efficiency, but Jessica viewed these resignations as opportunities to hire younger, less expensive employees who would be more receptive to her vision for the restaurant's future. She'd explain that older workers were resistant to change and innovation, that successful businesses required fresh perspectives and modern approaches to customer service. When I pointed out that we were losing institutional knowledge and customer relationships that had taken years to develop, she'd respond that sentimentality was a luxury that competitive businesses couldn't afford. Watching Romano's transformation was like witnessing the systematic destruction of everything I'd worked to create over the previous 4 decades. The warmth and personality that had made the restaurant special were being replaced by corporate efficiency and profit maximization. Regular customers began commenting on the changes, noting that the staff seemed less friendly, the atmosphere felt more sterile, and the overall experience was becoming indistinguishable from chain restaurants that prioritized turnover over customer satisfaction. But what hurt most was Marcus's apparent indifference to these changes, his willingness to sacrifice the values and principles his father had instilled in favor of whatever Jessica convinced him was necessary for business success. The son who'd grown up understanding that Romano's was more than just a restaurant, that it was a community gathering place that served families during their most important moments, seemed to have forgotten those lessons entirely in pursuit of maximum profitability. The breaking point in our relationship came during the Christmas season of 2017, traditionally the busiest and most profitable period of Romano's year. I'd always taken special pride in our holiday decorations and seasonal menu additions, working with employees to create an atmosphere that made our customers feel like they were celebrating with an extended family, rather than just dining at a commercial establishment. But Jessica had different ideas about how to maximize revenue during the holiday season, implementing policies that prioritized table turnover and average check size over the relaxed, festive atmosphere that had always been our trademark. She instituted time limits for dining parties, began charging for bread and appetizers that had always been complimentary, and eliminated the traditional holiday party we'd hosted for employees and their families every year since the restaurant opened. When I objected to these changes, pointing out that they contradicted the community-focused values that had always defined Romano's identity, Jessica responded with condescending lectures about modern business practices and the need to maximize seasonal opportunities for revenue generation. The confrontation that finally forced me to recognize the hopelessness of my situation occurred on December 23rd, during what should have been one of the happiest days of Romano's year. I'd arrived early to help with preparation for the dinner, rush, expecting to assist with food preparation or customer service as I'd always done during busy periods. Instead, Jessica handed me a mop bucket and a list of deep cleaning tasks that needed to be completed before the restaurant opened, including scrubbing the employee bathroom that had become my regular responsibility. As I knelt on the bathroom floor, working to remove stains and odors that seemed to reappear no matter how frequently I cleaned them, I could hear Jessica in the kitchen berating a young line cook for some minor mistake in food preparation. Her voice carried the same tone of contemptuous authority that she used with me, but hearing her treat a 19-year-old employee with identical disrespect somehow made me realize that this wasn't personal vendetta, directed specifically at me. This was simply how Jessica operated, how she maintained control over everyone around her through systematic humiliation and psychological manipulation. But what finally broke my heart was hearing Marcus laugh at something Jessica said, his voice carrying the easy intimacy of someone who was completely comfortable with his wife's behavior, who found her treatment of employees amusing rather than appalling. The son I'd raised to value kindness and respect, who'd learned hospitality principles from his father and grandmother, was not only tolerating, but actively enjoying the cruelty his wife was inflicting on the people who worked for them. That night, sitting alone in my apartment while Romano's hosted its busiest dinner service of the year, without any involvement from the woman who'd created the traditions they were systematically destroying, I finally accepted that Marcus was lost to me. Not temporarily misguided or temporarily influenced by his wife's bad advice, but fundamentally changed into someone who shared her values and priorities. The family business I'd devoted my life to preserving had become a weapon being used against me, and my own son was perfectly willing to watch me suffer for the sake of profits and power. But accepting defeat and surrendering completely were two different things. And that night, I began planning something I should have done months earlier. I started researching my legal options, investigating whether the ownership transfer had been conducted properly, exploring the possibility that I might have grounds for challenging the arrangements that had left me so vulnerable to exploitation. The woman who'd built Romano's from nothing hadn't survived 4 decades in the restaurant business by accepting unfair treatment passively, and it was time to remember who I'd been before love for my son had made me stupid and trusting. The research was discouraging initially, since the ownership transfer documents appeared to be legally sound, and the consultant arrangements had been structured carefully to avoid obvious fraud or misrepresentation. But as I dug deeper into the details, studying contracts and agreements with the analytical skills I'd developed during my accounting education, I began to notice inconsistencies and oversights that might provide leverage for challenging the current situation. More importantly, I realized that Jessica had made several mistakes in her systematic takeover of Romano's, errors that reflected her inexperience with restaurant operations and her overconfidence in her ability to manipulate people in situations without consequences. She'd assumed that I was too old, too trusting, and too emotionally dependent on Marcus to fight back effectively. But she'd underestimated the business acumen and determination that had enabled me to build Romano's in the first place. The first mistake was in the employment classification of my maintenance duties, which Jessica had structured to minimize tax obligations and benefit costs, but which violated several labor law requirements for independent contractor relationships. The second mistake was in the modification of profit-sharing arrangements, which had been changed without proper documentation and in ways that contradicted the original ownership transfer agreements. The third mistake was in the systematic reduction of my compensation, which could potentially be challenged as age discrimination if properly documented and presented. But Jessica's biggest mistake was assuming that I had no allies or resources beyond what she allowed me to access. She'd focused so completely on controlling my relationship with Marcus and my role at Romano's that she'd never considered the possibility that I might have maintained connections and friendships that existed independently of the family business. She'd never thought about the customers, employees, suppliers, and community members who'd known me for decades, and who might be willing to provide support if they understood what was happening. The plan that gradually took shape in my mind wasn't about revenge, though I'd be lying if I claimed that desire for justice wasn't a motivating factor. The plan was about reclaiming my dignity, protecting my financial security, and possibly saving Romanos from the people who were destroying everything. That had made it special. But most importantly, the plan was about demonstrating to myself that the woman who'd built something extraordinary from nothing was still alive inside the broken old lady who'd been scrubbing toilets for other people's entertainment. I started by documenting everything, photographing the conditions I was expected to work in, recording conversations with Jessica when legal to do so, and keeping detailed logs of my duties, hours, and compensation. I researched employment law resources for older workers, contacted organizations that provided legal assistance for age discrimination cases, and began building a comprehensive file that detailed the systematic exploitation I'd been subjected to since transferring ownership of Romano's to Marcus. The process was emotionally exhausting, forcing me to confront the full extent of how badly I'd been treated and how completely I'd allowed myself to be manipulated. But it was also empowering, reminding me that I possessed skills and knowledge that extended far beyond facility maintenance, that I was capable of strategic thinking and decisive action when circumstances required it. For the first time in months, I felt like Helen Romano, the businesswoman, rather than Helen Romano, the victim. The breakthrough came in January 2018, when I discovered that Jessica had been systematically overcharging customers for special events held in the private dining rooms that had been created from my former apartment. She'd been collecting deposits and final payments that exceeded the amounts recorded in Romano's official accounting records, essentially skimming profits that should have been reported as business income. The amounts weren't enormous, but they were consistent and clearly intentional, representing exactly the kind of financial impropriety that could provide leverage for challenging her authority and credibility. More importantly, the overcharging scheme demonstrated that Jessica's commitment to Romano's success was secondary to her personal financial gain, that she was willing to jeopardize the restaurant's reputation and legal standing for relatively modest amounts of money. This wasn't just poor judgment or aggressive business practices. This was fraud that could have serious consequences for everyone involved if discovered by tax authorities or reported by customers who realized they'd been systematically cheated. But I needed more than evidence of Jessica's misconduct. I needed allies who could help me use that evidence effectively. The first person I approached was Maria Santos, my former assistant manager who'd been forced to resign after Jessica decided that her position was redundant and her salary could be eliminated to improve profit margins. Maria had worked at Romano's for 15 years, knew every aspect of the restaurant's operations, and had maintained relationships with many of our longtime customers after leaving for a position at a competitor's establishment. When I explained what had been happening since the ownership transfer, Maria was shocked but not surprised, having witnessed the beginning of Jessica's takeover during her final months at Romano's. She'd suspected that my situation was becoming untenable, but she'd assumed that Marcus would eventually recognize his wife's behavior and intervene on my behalf. Learning that the situation had deteriorated to the point where I was essentially working as unpaid janitorial help while Jessica skimmed profits was horrifying to someone who remembered me as the respected owner and operator of one of the area's most successful restaurants. Maria agreed to help me document Jessica's fraudulent activities, using her continued relationships with Romano's suppliers and former employees to gather information about financial irregularities and management practices that violated industry standards. More importantly, she helped me understand that my situation wasn't unique, that Jessica had been systematically exploiting and humiliating other people as well, creating a pattern of behavior that extended far beyond her treatment of me. The second ally was Roberto Vega, the accountant who'd handled Romano's tax preparation for over 20 years and who'd been replaced by Jessica with a less experienced professional who was supposedly more cost-effective. Roberto had always been uncomfortable with the ownership transfer arrangements, feeling that I'd been inadequately protected during the transition. but he'd assumed that family loyalty would prevent any serious problems. When I showed him evidence of the financial irregularities and employment law violations, he immediately offered to provide whatever assistance I needed to address the situation. Roberto's analysis of Romano's financial records revealed that the problems were more extensive than I'd realized. Jessica had been manipulating expense reports, misclassifying various costs to minimize tax obligations, and maintaining accounting practices that would likely trigger audits if discovered by regulatory authorities. The restaurant was still profitable, but the profits were being generated through methods that were ethically questionable and potentially illegal, creating liability issues that could jeopardize Romano's future operations. But the most valuable ally turned out to be someone I'd never expected: Detective Linda Morrison of the Millbrook Police Department, whose family had been regular customers at Romano's for over 20 years, and who'd always appreciated the way we'd treated her children during their birthday celebrations and special occasions. Linda had noticed the changes in Romano's atmosphere during recent visits, commenting to her husband that the restaurant felt less welcoming and more commercial than it had in the past. When I approached Linda informally, explaining that I was concerned about potential financial irregularities at Romano's, but wasn't sure how to proceed, she immediately understood the implications of what I was describing. She couldn't investigate officially without formal complaints or evidence of specific crimes, but she could provide guidance about documentation requirements and legal procedures that might be relevant to my situation. More importantly, she could connect me with resources for elderly victims of financial exploitation, including legal aid organizations that specialized in cases involving family business disputes. Linda's involvement legitimized my concerns in ways that gave me confidence to pursue more aggressive action. If a police detective with decades of experience recognized the seriousness of what Jessica was doing, then I wasn't overreacting or allowing personal grievances to cloud my judgment. I was a victim of systematic exploitation who had both the right and the responsibility to seek appropriate remedies, regardless of the family relationships involved. The plan that emerged from these consultations was comprehensive and carefully structured to maximize pressure while minimizing risk. First, I would file formal complaints with appropriate regulatory authorities, including the Department of Labor for employment law violations and the Internal Revenue Service for tax fraud issues. Second, I would document all evidence of financial irregularities and forward copies to Romano's business insurance carriers, who would be interested in policy violations that could affect coverage. Third, I would contact local media outlets that specialized in consumer protection stories, since Jessica's customer overcharging scheme represented exactly the kind of business misconduct that generated public interest and outrage. But the most important element of the plan was a direct confrontation with Marcus, a final attempt to make him understand what his wife was doing and how it was affecting not just me, but the entire Romano's organization. I still loved my son despite everything that had happened, and I wanted to give him one last opportunity to choose between supporting Jessica's destructive behavior and protecting the family legacy his father had died believing he would preserve. The confrontation was scheduled for a Sunday morning in February 2018, when Romano's was closed and we could speak privately without Jessica's interference or the distraction of restaurant operations. I'd prepared a comprehensive presentation documenting all the evidence I'd gathered, including financial records, employment law violations, and witness statements from former employees who'd experienced Jessica's management style firsthand. My goal wasn't to destroy Marcus's marriage or force him to choose between his wife and his mother, but rather to make him understand the legal and ethical consequences of continuing to allow Jessica's behavior to go unchallenged. Marcus arrived, at Romano's looking tired and stressed, clearly anticipating another round of complaints about Jessica's management decisions or requests for increased compensation. He'd brought coffee and pastries from the bakery down the street, gestures that suggested he was hoping to keep our conversation friendly and superficial, rather than addressing the fundamental problems that had been developing over the previous year. When I began laying out the documentation I'd prepared, His expression shifted from mild annoyance to genuine surprise to growing alarm as he realized the scope and seriousness of what I was presenting. The financial irregularities were particularly troubling to Marcus, who'd always prided himself on Romano's reputation for honest business practices and community responsibility. His father had taught him that a restaurant's success depended on trust relationships with customers, employees, and suppliers, that shortcuts and questionable practices might generate temporary profits, but would ultimately destroy the foundation for long-term success. Seeing evidence that Jessica had been systematically violating those principles in pursuit of personal gain was clearly devastating to someone who'd grown up believing that Romano's represented something more significant than mere commercial enterprise. But the employment law violations were even more disturbing, since they demonstrated that Jessica's treatment of me wasn't just personal cruelty, but part of a pattern of illegal behavior that created liability for the entire business. Marcus had always assumed that family businesses were exempt from certain regulations, or that informal arrangements between relatives didn't need to comply with the same standards as conventional employer-employee relationships. Learning that Jessica's manipulation of my compensation and working conditions violated multiple federal and state laws was a shock that forced him to recognize the potential consequences of allowing the current situation to continue. The conversation lasted over 3 hours, with Marcus asking detailed questions about each piece of evidence and gradually accepting that his wife had been systematically deceiving him about her management practices and treatment of employees. He'd been aware that I was unhappy with my reduced role at Romano's, but Jessica had convinced him that my complaints reflected generational differences and resistance to necessary changes, rather than legitimate grievances about illegal or unethical behavior. Discovering that she'd been lying to him about fundamental aspects of how the restaurant was being operated was clearly devastating to someone who'd trusted her judgment completely. When I finished presenting all the evidence, Marcus sat quietly for several minutes, staring at the documents spread across the table while processing the implications of what he'd learned. Finally, he looked up at me with an expression that reminded me of the little boy who'd confessed to breaking something valuable, ashamed and sorry, but not sure how to fix what had been damaged. The words that came out of his mouth changed everything, though not in the way I'd hoped. Instead of expressing outrage at Jessica's behavior or promising to address the problems immediately, Marcus asked me what I wanted him to do about the situation. Not what he should do or what was right, but what I specifically expected from him in response to learning that his wife had been systematically exploiting his mother and defrauding his customers. The question revealed that Marcus had fundamentally changed since his marriage, that his primary loyalty was now to Jessica rather than to the values and principles his father had tried to instill. He wasn't asking how to correct the problems, because he didn't see them as problems that required correction, but rather as complications that needed to be managed in ways that wouldn't disrupt his marriage or threaten his comfortable lifestyle. The son who'd grown up understanding the difference between right and wrong had been replaced by someone who was primarily concerned with avoiding conflict and maintaining personal convenience. When I explained that I expected him to insist that Jessica correct her illegal practices and restore my proper role at Romano's, Marcus responded that such dramatic changes would be difficult to implement without creating family harmony problems. That might be worse than the current situation. When I pointed out that family harmony built on exploitation and fraud wasn't worth preserving, he suggested that perhaps I was being overly dramatic about issues that could probably be resolved through better communication and mutual compromise. That was the moment I realized that Marcus was lost to me permanently, that Jessica's influence had corrupted him so completely that he was incapable of recognizing obvious moral and legal violations when they conflicted with his personal interests. The family business his father had died believing would be preserved and protected had become nothing more than a source of income for people who had no understanding of or respect for the values that had made Romano's special. But Marcus's moral failure also clarified my own path forward. If my son was unwilling to address Jessica's behavior voluntarily, then I would need to use the legal and regulatory resources I'd identified to force changes that protected both my interests and Romano's reputation. The confrontation I'd hoped would restore our relationship had instead demonstrated that some betrayals are too fundamental to forgive or overlook, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for family members is hold them accountable for behavior they're too corrupt to recognize as wrong. The conversation ended with Marcus asking me to give him time to discuss the situation with Jessica and develop solutions that would address my concerns without causing unnecessary disruption to Romano's operations. I agreed to wait 1 week for his response, though I made it clear that my patience was exhausted and that failure to implement meaningful changes would force me to pursue other remedies. We parted with stiff embraces that felt more like goodbye than see you later, both of us understanding that our relationship had been fundamentally altered by his inability to choose between his wife's convenience and his mother's dignity. That week was the longest of my life, filled with sleepless nights and endless speculation about whether Marcus might still find the courage to do what was right. I'd raised him to be honorable and principled, and despite everything that had happened, I still hoped that confronting him with undeniable evidence of Jessica's misconduct might reawaken the moral compass his father had tried to instill. But, deep down, I knew that hoping for dramatic change was probably unrealistic, that people who'd become comfortable with exploitation and fraud weren't likely to suddenly develop ethical standards that required personal sacrifice. The answer came, exactly 1 week later, delivered not through direct conversation, but through Marcus's actions. Instead of addressing Jessica's illegal practices or restoring my proper role at Romano's, he doubled down on supporting her authority by giving her an official promotion to general manager with expanded responsibilities for all aspects of restaurant operations. Instead of investigating the financial irregularities I'd documented, he announced new policies that gave Jessica complete control over accounting and cash management. Instead of acknowledging the employment law violations, he presented Jessica's treatment of me as an example of efficient resource utilization that other family businesses should emulate. But the cruelest part of Marcus's response was the way he framed my complaints as symptoms of age-related confusion and resentment, rather than legitimate grievances about illegal behavior. He suggested to other family members and longtime customers that I was struggling to accept my reduced role at Romano's, that Jessica was being patient and understanding with an elderly relative who was having difficulty adapting to retirement. He turned my fight for dignity and justice into evidence of mental decline, using my love for the family business against me in ways that were both calculated and devastating. That was when I knew that patience and family loyalty had become luxuries I could no longer afford. The son I'd raised and trusted had chosen to protect the woman who was destroying everything we'd built together, and my continued silence was enabling their exploitation not just of me but of customers, employees, and the community that had supported Romano's for nearly 4 decades. It was time to make the phone calls I'd been hoping I wouldn't need to make. Time to implement the plan that would hold them accountable for behavior they'd assumed would never have consequences. The first call went to the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division, where I filed formal complaints about Jessica's manipulation of my employment classification and compensation. The second call went to the Internal Revenue Service's Fraud Hotline, where I reported the systematic underreporting of income and misclassification of business expenses. The third call went to the local media outlet that specialized in consumer protection stories, where I provided documentation of Jessica's customer overcharging scheme and its impact on Romano's reputation in the community. But the most important call went to my lawyer, Roberto's referral, who specialized in family business disputes and elder abuse cases. Attorney Sarah Mitchell listened to my story with the focused attention of someone who'd handled similar situations many times before, asking detailed questions about the ownership transfer documents and the subsequent changes in my role and compensation. When I finished explaining what had happened, she was quiet for several minutes before delivering an assessment that was both devastating and empowering. The ownership transfer had been structured legally, but the subsequent modifications to My compensation and working conditions violated multiple laws and created grounds for challenging the entire arrangement. More importantly, Jessica's systematic exploitation of my age and family relationship constituted elder abuse under state law, which carried both civil and criminal penalties that could result in significant consequences for everyone involved. The evidence I'd gathered was comprehensive and compelling, providing a strong foundation for legal action that could potentially restore my financial security and protect other vulnerable individuals from similar exploitation. Sarah explained that family business disputes involving elder abuse were becoming increasingly common as adult children sought to gain control of family assets while their parents were still alive. The legal system had developed specialized procedures and remedies for addressing these situations, including provisions for recovering damages, restoring proper compensation, and preventing future exploitation. But she also warned that pursuing legal action against family members was emotionally devastating, and that I should be prepared for responses that were designed to undermine my credibility and resolve. The decision to proceed with legal action wasn't easy, despite the overwhelming evidence of wrongdoing and the clear need for accountability. This was still my son, the child I'd raised and loved, and hoped would carry on his father's legacy of integrity and community service. Filing lawsuits and criminal complaints against Marcus felt like admitting that I'd failed as a mother, that everything I'd tried to teach him about right and wrong had been inadequate preparation for the moral challenges he'd face as an adult. But watching Romano's being destroyed by people who valued profits over principles was even more devastating than acknowledging my son's moral failures. The restaurant Anthony and I had built together represented more than just our personal success. It was a community institution that had served families during their most important moments for nearly 4 decades. Allowing Jessica's destructive practices to continue unchallenged would be a betrayal of everyone who'd supported Romano's over the years. Everyone who'd trusted us to maintain the standards and values that had made the restaurant special. The legal papers were filed on March 15, 2018, exactly 4 years after I'd signed over ownership of Romano's to Marcus in a gesture of love and trust that had been systematically exploited by people who understood neither concept. The civil suit included claims for wage theft, age discrimination, breach of fiduciary duty, and elder abuse, seeking both monetary damages and injunctive relief that would restore proper oversight of Romano's operations. The criminal complaints included charges of fraud, tax evasion, and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, which could result in significant fines and possible imprisonment for Jessica if proven in court. But the most important element of the legal action was the emergency injunction that froze Romano's assets and required independent oversight of its financial operations while the various claims were being investigated. This meant that Jessica could no longer manipulate accounting records or continue her systematic overcharging of customers, that proper employment law compliance would be monitored by outside professionals, and that my compensation would be restored to appropriate levels while the case was pending. The injunction was granted within 48 hours of filing, based on the strength of the evidence and the court's concern about ongoing harm to both me and Romano's customers. Jessica's initial response was predictable outrage about interference with her management authority, but her tune changed quickly when she realized that violation of court orders could result in contempt charges and immediate arrest. Marcus seemed stunned by the speed and scope of the legal action, apparently having assumed that my threats were empty bluffs rather than serious commitments to seeking justice. The impact on Romano's was immediate and dramatic. News of the legal action spread quickly through Millbrook's close-knit community, with longtime customers expressing shock and disappointment about the treatment I'd received and the fraudulent practices that had been uncovered. Several major corporate accounts canceled their catering contracts, citing concerns about the restaurant's ethical standards and management practices. Local media coverage was extensive and uniformly negative, focusing on the systematic exploitation of an elderly woman by family members who'd gained her trust through false promises and manipulation. But the most satisfying response came from Romano's employees, both current and former, who began providing additional evidence of Jessica's misconduct and expressing relief that someone had finally challenged behavior they'd been forced to tolerate, in silence. The culture of fear and intimidation that Jessica had created was immediately undermined by the knowledge that her authority was no longer absolute, that there were consequences for the abuse and exploitation she'd been inflicting on vulnerable people. Within 2 weeks of the injunction being granted, Jessica's position at Romano's had become untenable. The independent oversight required by the court made it impossible for her to continue her fraudulent practices, while the negative publicity made her presence a liability for the restaurant's reputation and customer relationships. She resigned from all positions at Romano's, claiming that the stress of false accusations was affecting her health and that she needed to focus on defending herself against what she characterized as vindictive attacks by a disgruntled former employee. Marcus's response was more complex, reflecting his conflicted loyalty between his wife and the family business that represented his inheritance and livelihood. Initially, he supported Jessica publicly, characterizing the legal action as a misunderstanding that would be resolved once all the facts were properly presented. But as evidence continued to mount and the financial impact on Romano's became undeniable, he began distancing himself from his wife's practices while insisting that he'd been unaware of her illegal activities. The transformation was remarkable to witness, though not particularly admirable from a moral perspective. The son who'd been perfectly willing to watch me scrub toilets while his wife skimmed profits suddenly became concerned about proper treatment of elderly family members and appropriate business ethics. The man who'd dismissed my complaints as age-related confusion suddenly recognized the legitimacy of employment law violations and the importance of transparent financial practices. But by then, it was too late for Marcus to salvage our relationship through belated recognition of obvious problems. The legal action had revealed not just Jessica's misconduct, but his complicity in allowing that misconduct to continue, despite clear evidence of its harmful effects. Even if he'd been genuinely unaware of some of Jessica's illegal activities, he'd been completely aware of how she was treating me and had chosen to support her authority rather than protect his mother's dignity and well-being. The court proceedings continued for 8 months, during which Romano's operations were carefully monitored and gradually restored to proper legal and ethical standards. My compensation was restored to appropriate levels. My working conditions were improved to comply with labor law requirements, and my role was expanded to include meaningful involvement in management decisions. More importantly, the systematic overcharging of customers was eliminated, proper tax reporting was implemented, and transparent accounting practices were established to prevent future financial irregularities. The final settlement was more generous than I'd dared to hope, including substantial monetary damages for the wages I'd been illegally denied, compensation for the emotional distress caused by systematic exploitation, and punitive damages that reflected the court's disapproval of Jessica's conduct. But the most important outcome wasn't financial. It was the restoration of my dignity and the public vindication of my claims about how I'd been treated. Jessica faced criminal charges that resulted in significant fines and a probationary sentence that required community service and restitution to the customers she'd defrauded. More importantly, her conviction created a permanent record that would follow her in any future employment or business ventures, serving as a warning to potential victims about her willingness to exploit vulnerable individuals for personal gain. Marcus avoided criminal charges, though the civil settlement required him to implement comprehensive reforms at Romano's and submit to ongoing oversight that would prevent future violations. His reputation in the community was permanently damaged, but he retained ownership of the restaurant and the opportunity to rebuild its operations according to the principles his father had tried to instill. But our personal relationship was irreparably broken, damaged beyond any possibility of restoration by his willingness to sacrifice my well-being for his wife's convenience and his own comfort. The son I'd raised and loved had proven himself incapable of basic decency when it conflicted with personal advantage, and no amount of legal victory could repair the heartbreak caused by that fundamental betrayal. The phone call that changed everything had actually been a series of calls, each one representing a step away from victimhood and toward accountability for people who'd assumed their behavior would never have consequences. The woman who'd been scrubbing toilets while being systematically exploited had remembered who she really was and what she was capable of when pushed beyond the limits of tolerance and human dignity. Romano survived the crisis and eventually prospered again under reformed management, though it took years to fully restore the community trust that had been damaged by Jessica's fraudulent practices. The restaurant that Anthony and I had built together continued to serve families and create memories, though the family that had created it would never be whole again. But sometimes the most important victory isn't preserving relationships that have become toxic, but rather protecting yourself and others from people who view kindness as weakness and family loyalty as an opportunity for exploitation. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior, even when that behavior comes from people you'd hope to love and trust for the rest of your life. 5 years have passed since that final phone call changed everything, and I'm writing this from my new office overlooking the harbor in downtown Portland, where I've built something I never thought possible at my age. Romano's Elder Advocacy Foundation operates out of a converted warehouse that houses our legal clinic, counseling services, and educational programs designed to protect older adults from the kind of family exploitation I experienced firsthand. The foundation wasn't part of any grand plan when I first picked up that phone to report Jessica's crimes. Back then, I was simply a broken woman fighting for her dignity and financial survival. But as word spread about my legal victory, other elderly victims began reaching out, sharing stories that were heartbreakingly similar to my own. Adult children who'd manipulated their parents into signing over businesses, homes, and life savings. Grandparents who'd been reduced to unpaid household help while their families enjoyed the fruits of their lifetime's work. Seniors who'd discovered, too late, that love and trust had been weaponized against them by the very people they'd raised and sacrificed for. The settlement money from my case provided the initial funding, but the foundation has grown beyond anything I could have imagined. We've helped over 3,000 families navigate situations involving elder financial abuse, recovered millions of dollars in stolen assets, and successfully prosecuted hundreds of cases involving family members who thought blood relationships gave them license to exploit vulnerable relatives. More importantly, we've changed laws in 7 states to provide better protection for seniors and created educational programs that help families avoid the destructive patterns that nearly destroyed mine. Jessica Chen served 18 months in minimum security prison and was ordered to pay full restitution to every customer she'd defrauded during her reign at Romano's. Her conviction made headlines in several states, serving as a warning to other would-be scammers that elderly abuse carries serious consequences regardless of family relationships. She moved to Florida after her release, where last I heard she was working as a low-level bookkeeper for a small accounting firm that apparently didn't run thorough background checks. The woman who'd once treated me like hired help learned what it felt like to start over with nothing, building a new life while carrying the permanent burden of a criminal record. Marcus kept Romano's running for 3 years after the settlement, implementing the court-ordered reforms and gradually rebuilding the restaurant's reputation in the community. But the business was never the same after Jessica's crimes became public knowledge. Too many customers had been personally affected by her overcharging scheme, too many longtime employees had witnessed her treatment of me, and too many community members felt betrayed by the family they'd supported for decades. The warmth and trust that had always been Romano's greatest assets couldn't be restored through legal compliance and better management practices. He sold the restaurant in 2021 to a corporate chain that kept the Romano's name, but completely changed the menu, atmosphere, and operational philosophy. The building where Anthony and I had built our dreams, where Marcus had grown up learning the values his father tried to instill, became just another standardized dining establishment designed to maximize efficiency and profit margins. Watching the sale from a distance was painful. but it was also fitting that the family business we'd created with love and sacrifice should die rather than continue as a hollow shell of its former self. Marcus tried to contact me several times during the years following our legal battle, sending birthday cards and holiday greetings that seemed designed more to assuage his guilt than to rebuild our relationship. The messages were always carefully worded, expressing general regret about how things had developed, while avoiding any specific acknowledgement of the choices he'd made or the harm his decisions had caused. He wanted forgiveness without accountability, reconciliation without responsibility, and restoration of family ties without addressing the fundamental character flaws that had enabled Jessica's exploitation in the first place. I never responded to his overtures, not out of vindictiveness, but because I'd learned the difference between forgiveness and enabling destructive behavior. Forgiving Marcus didn't require me to pretend that his choices hadn't revealed something essential about his character, and loving him didn't mean I had to make myself vulnerable to future betrayal. Some relationships can't be repaired because the damage goes too deep, because the trust that was broken can never be rebuilt, because the person you thought you knew turned out to be someone entirely different. The foundation work has been the most meaningful chapter of my life, more fulfilling than even the early days of building Romanos with Anthony. Every family we help, every predator we stop, every law we change represents a victory against the kind of exploitation that nearly destroyed me. The elderly clients who walk into our offices broken and ashamed leave with restored dignity and practical solutions to problems they thought were hopeless. The families we educate about warning signs and preventive measures avoid the heartbreak that comes from discovering too late that love has been weaponized against them. But perhaps the most rewarding aspect of this work has been mentoring other women who found themselves in situations similar to mine. Women who'd built successful businesses or accumulated substantial assets only to have family members systematically strip away their financial security and personal autonomy. Women who'd been told they were too old, too confused, or too emotional to manage their own affairs. Women who'd been made to feel guilty for expecting basic respect and fair treatment from the people they'd spent their lives supporting and nurturing. These women arrive at our foundation angry, hurt, and convinced that their situations are hopeless because family loyalty should trump personal justice. They leave understanding that demanding accountability from people who've betrayed your trust isn't vindictive but necessary, that protecting yourself from exploitation isn't selfish but essential, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for family members is refuse to enable their destructive behavior. The legal victories are satisfying, but the personal transformations are miraculous. Watching a 70-year-old woman discover that she doesn't have to accept abuse because it comes from her children, seeing an 80-year-old man realize that his financial resources belong to him regardless of his family's expectations, helping seniors understand that age doesn't diminish their right to dignity and respect. These moments remind me why that phone call 5 years ago was the most important decision of my life. My own transformation has been just as remarkable. The woman who once scrubbed toilets while being systematically humiliated has become a recognized expert on elder abuse prevention, testifying before legislative committees and speaking at conferences across the country. The victim who felt powerless and alone has built an organization that employs 43 people and maintains offices in 6 states. The mother who was betrayed by her own son has created a legacy that will protect thousands of families from similar heartbreak. I'm 73 years old now, the same age Laura Butler was when she finally recognized how she'd been exploited by the people she loved most. But unlike Laura, I didn't wait until retirement age to demand better treatment or discover my own worth. I learned that lesson at 68, when I still had time and energy to build something meaningful from the ashes of betrayal and disappointment. The phone call that saved my life wasn't really about punishment or revenge, though justice was certainly part of the equation. It was about remembering who I was before love made me vulnerable to exploitation, about reclaiming the strength and determination that had enabled me to build Romanos in the first place. It was about refusing to accept a diminished role simply because other people found my diminishment convenient or profitable. Most importantly, it was about understanding that family relationships built on exploitation and maintained through manipulation aren't worth preserving at any cost. Real love demands honesty, respect, and reciprocity. Anything less is just dependency dressed up with sentimental language, obligation disguised as affection, control masquerading as care. The woman who once believed that maternal love required endless sacrifice and unconditional forgiveness learned that the most loving thing you can do is sometimes set boundaries that protect everyone involved from destructive patterns. The mother who thought family loyalty meant accepting whatever treatment her children chose to dish out discovered that demanding accountability actually serves everyone's best interests in the long run. Romano's Elder Advocacy Foundation will outlive me, continuing to protect vulnerable seniors long after I'm gone. The legal precedents we've established will make it harder for future predators to exploit family relationships for financial gain. The educational programs we've developed will help families recognize warning signs before situations become crisis-level emergencies. But the most important legacy isn't institutional or legal. It's the thousands of individuals who've learned that age doesn't diminish their value, that family ties don't justify exploitation, that demanding respect isn't selfish or unreasonable. It's the knowledge that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is pick up the phone and report the people who are hurting you, even when those people share your name and your history. That phone call 5 years ago didn't just save me from continued exploitation. It saved me from the despair that comes from accepting unacceptable treatment, from the hopelessness that comes from believing you have no options, from the shame that comes from thinking you deserve whatever cruelty others choose to inflict. The woman who made that call wasn't the victim who'd been scrubbing toilets for other people's entertainment. She was Helen Romano, the businesswoman who'd built something extraordinary from nothing, the survivor who'd overcome devastating loss and financial crisis, the fighter who'd never learned to accept defeat gracefully. Sometimes it takes a crisis to remind you who you really are underneath all the roles and relationships that define your daily existence. Sometimes it takes betrayal to teach you the difference between love and manipulation, between family loyalty and enabling destructive behavior, between forgiveness and doormat syndrome. The phone call that changed everything was really a call back to myself, back to the woman I'd been before I confused maternal love with financial indulgence, before I mistook family harmony for personal happiness, before I allowed other people's convenience to become more important than my own dignity. That woman had always been there, waiting for the right moment to emerge from hiding and reclaim what was rightfully hers. The phone call simply gave her permission to stop apologizing for wanting what everyone deserves: respect, fairness, and the freedom to live according to her own values rather than other people's expectations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them. Out!